Okay, Peter, thank you for joining me in this conversation around the importance of inner development at this time. I was thinking for some of the audience who may be seeing this, maybe they don't know that much about your background. So I was wondering if you could give me a short context and also maybe add, if you want to, what kind of keeps you up at night right now?
Well, I've been doing things for a long time. I've been doing similar things for a very, very long time. I mean, in a way, I've had the good fortune that most everything I've done in my life were only the things that I really cared about, and in many ways, kind of a continuous line. I once had this awakening, this was quite a few years ago, that my desk at MIT had not moved more than about 5 meters in 20 years. And it never hit me, all these things going on. And it became kind of a metaphor. Lived in the same place for 45 years. I mean, in some ways, my kind of just personal life experience is this sense of just doing the same thing and being the same. Of course, all the circumstances change and the particulars all change. But I've always been very concerned with how the hell are humans going to live in this world, since obviously we're very clever and we're very unintelligent. So we're clever about particular things like technology, like that'd be a perfect example. But we're not very intelligent because no intelligent species would systematically work to destroy the conditions for its own living.
Yeah.
And we all know we're doing that, and yet we persist. And that, to me, has always been the question. How can we know that we're doing it and persist? Obviously, the word know there is part of the problem, because we kind of know it here, but it's not enough.
No, exactly, yeah. I mean, that resonates with my life as well, like the knowing-doing gap and thinking that, like, if I just understand something, that will actually lead to change. Would you say that that's what keeps you up at night now?
Well, first off, to be honest, nothing keeps me up at night, but I understand it's a metaphor.
It's a metaphor. I love that.
So, yeah, I would say so. I think that's the core question. I was visiting with a friend I hadn't seen in about 10 years, about last week. She's also was at MIT, then Harvard stole her from MIT, so she became a strategy professor at Harvard. And she's really good, and she's really, really very respected. And starting about 5 to 10 years ago, she got deeply engaged in sustainability and things like that. And then she ended up even writing a book on reinventing capitalism. And she said it very simply. She said, I always thought if we only understood what we were doing, we would change. If we only understood the way capitalism works today was so destructive, so we would obviously change. And you could tell she's been through about a 2-year period of going on retreat. Because it like hit her, like running up against a wall in a dark room. Bang. Oh my. Just knowing what you're doing, understanding it, isn't enough. And she quit the business school. She resigned her position. She went on retreat. She's been on retreat for almost 2 years now. She has a Buddhist teacher, even though traditionally I don't think she had any particular contemplative or process, but she said, like, something's wrong here and something has to change in me. It was very touching. And I think her life story is also one that's very meaningful for a lot of people. Sooner or later, we hit the wall and realize, what are we doing? And oftentimes, of course, happens around kids. When you're, like we were talking, when you're about to have children, all of a sudden, you're catapulted into a different point of view about life. But I think there's other stages in our life when that happens also. Still, it's more an individual phenomenon, and the problem is obviously not just individual. I mean, you or I could not destroy a species if we tried. No individual has that kind of power. But collectively, we do a very good job. So obviously, it's a collective, not just individual problem.
Yeah, exactly. And would you say that, like looking at that system's view or the collective of humanity, I mean, because in some sense, like my felt sense, and also people in my network, it does feel that society at large may be hitting that wall now. Do you see that pattern as well, and do you have any examples of that?
Well, obviously it's just an interpretation, but it's one I would share as well. And the kind of evidence that stands out is the global epidemic of stress, anxiety, suicide rates. It really is arguably the biggest health issue in the world today.
Yeah.
So that would be an indicator that a lot of people are going, what's going on? I always think children are kind of like the canaries in the coal mine, because they're very perceptive, very intuitive, and they don't have a lot of filters. No. So you talk to a 5 or 6 year old, they pretty much tell you what they really think.
They'll
right?
be honest.
They haven't gotten to the point where, well, I think this, but I better not say this to him. And so I think that is very present for kids. I've not been in serious conversations with young children for 15 years where climate change and poverty didn't arise naturally in the conversation of what's really on their mind. Well, climate change is kind of an indicator of all the economic or ecological stress, and poverty is the fact that how can we live as a people knowing there's so many people who are basically you and me who are so without. So I would say that that's very much on the mind of young children. In the United States, suicide rates of teenagers have doubled in the last decade before COVID. We still don't have all the data.
No.
So it's not just COVID. It's something that's much more long-term. So yes, I would say we're hitting the wall.
Yeah, and I think that, the social technologies that we're enabling young people to, completely live their lives within is a good, point for that as well. And speaking to young individuals, they even say that, they know that this isn't good for them. They wish that they were without their phones and that they would not want to be on social media, but still, again, the knowing-doing gap. And they don't really see an alternative towards that.
And they don't see many good models, right?
No.
It's natural, regardless of your thinking process, it's natural when you're young you look up at adults. It's just natural. It doesn't mean you want to be just like them. Usually at some age you want to be the opposite of them, right? But you're oriented that way naturally. So what do you see? You see your parents just as addicted as you are. You see them stressed and running and very unhappy deep down. And again, kids are very perceptive. So they don't have a lot of inspiring models, many of them, in their everyday life.
No, exactly. This is like the reason why I've dedicated my life to this type of work is because of that. Like my father was an Olympic athlete, but deeply unhappy. So always striving for the next success and then never becoming satisfied, basically. And me observing that with steroids and painkillers and like a very unsustainable way of living, it just hit me when I was very young that adults are crazy. Like they're like, how can they not see? In a word, how can they not see the reality of relationships being very important for happiness? That's so clear. If you just look at your bank account and then look another person in the eyes, like you'll feel more emotion when you look people in the eyes. And it does seem that we don't have role models at large, but there's also a kind of lack of that conversation, it seems, even. Like that reflection on who do we want to become. And maybe that's a result of postmodernism, saying that all perspectives are equal, so there can't be a direction. Yeah.
Well, I don't think it's that simple. I think that postmodernism is a kind of interpretation for a certain attitude towards things, and a lot of spiritual traditions have a very similar view that it's all equally meaningless.
Yeah.
But they don't end up in the same place of disengagement and fear. It's just that you let go of your attachments to this is more important than this. There's an old saying in traditional Chan or Zen cultivation in China that enlightenment is easy for he who has no preferences. So preferences is a source of dis-ease, but that isn't necessarily bad, of course. So I don't think that it's fair to say that all views being equal kind of accounts for it. No, I think obviously we all as humans create our own stories about what's going on. the only real criterion, as far as I can see, is it a useful story? I mean, it doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's a story, right? But to me, the progressive materialization of Western culture, increasing focus on everything that's physical and tangible, and obviously how big my house is and how many cars I have and how much money is in my bank account is a symbol for being able to do all those things. I think it's a very deep problem. It's not a new one. I think as we understand more and more about the whole of human history, let's say the last 100,000 years, there are many ups and downs. You know, yes, we love to look at certain tribal cultures that have been around for 15 or 20,000 years, but there's a lot of others that don't last very long. They come and go, or they go through cycles of huge buildup and collapse. The Mayan people built these magnificent, complexes, ceremonial complexes, between about 500 or 600 and about 900, and then they all obviously collapsed. But the Mayan people didn't go away. When you travel around Guatemala, Yucatan in Mexico, Chiapas in Mexico, people look remarkably similar to those stelas you see, and they still speak, until very recently, spoke Mayan. So clearly, the underlying culture went through a huge buildup and collapse. And most historians feel that when you see a lot of monument building, that's almost always a sign of concentration of power, because a lot of people have to sacrifice, so few people get glorified monuments. But then, that concentration of power just doesn't go forever. And sooner or later, you get so out of harmony with your environment that you may have environmental problems start to rise. That's a recurring story of humans. So I think that we have to recognize in many ways what we're living through today. Humans have lived through many, many times before. And in traditional Chinese culture, which is interesting, because that's a relatively continuous 5,000 years or so of literate and pre-literate, but pretty well understood what happened. They always say, many golden times and many not so golden times. The main difference now is that we're going through this kind of build-up and collapse at a global scale. As far as we know, that's never happened. So it's not just a group of people living in a particular setting in a particular context. It's really humans living in the world. So I think that's what's really unique. Are we capable of learning and evolving at the scale that we seem to be determined to try to live at now? That's a big question. Yeah,
exactly. And I mean, that's where the SDGs seem to be, the UN's way of mapping the complexity, and then, but not necessarily adding the inner dimensions of cultures or of individuals to say, how do we kind of shift this? I guess in the latest UNDP report, they're actually pointing towards the inner aspects a lot more and saying we're not making enough progress for this global shift or at the pace that's needed. Because I'm thinking also around there's been these ebb and flows of the inner dimension being very important, right, historically as well. Thinking about the 70s. And how come that, what's your perspective on, how come that kind of died down instead of being something that really took hold and became an integrated part of how we build schools or navigate businesses or politics?
It's a good question, because some of us even lived through it. So there's a lot to reflect on there. It was, if you remember, one of the terms that was often used was the countercultural movement. It was against something. I think that also is inherently limiting. The energy to fight against something is by its nature limited. You just hold your body like this. Your body won't stay like this for long, right? It takes more and more effort. So, and I think that was part of the identity. That was a cool thing. Drop out. Literally, there was times where. So, I think that's very different than, how do we build a society that can really work for everybody? So I don't think that it was a, quote, failure. We could think of it more like a warm-up period.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So, it was great music. It was amazing art. There was incredible energy. And yet it wasn't enough, and it kind of faded. You're absolutely right. What can we learn? I think the instincts. It was funny. We were sitting around this morning, and hearing a bunch of old Bob Dylan songs sung by Bob Dylan. You know, of course, when you live there, it brings back such deep memories. Because, of course, first it's the aesthetic. So those kind of periods, there's usually an aesthetic coherence. You know, the words and music start to go together, and you feel like, whoa, this is beautiful, or this is powerful, or this touches me. And yet, it was always, you know, seen as kind of a fringe thing by the people who were really in the middle of it. But we shouldn't disregard it. I think that you might say, and this is generally true of artistic communities, you know, that they tend to be more in touch with things than the mainstream. Sometimes they're wildly off base, sometimes they're remarkably on. But these movements often start in artistic communities, but they eventually have to find ways to infiltrate the mainstream. And you know, the other obvious problem is that, you know, if you just think of it in terms of forces, there's such powerful forces to conserve the way it is. I mean, that's the most obvious immediate response to my puzzle. How can we be so totally unintelligent, irrational collectively? Well, the obvious answer is, well, there's powerful forces determined to keep things going the way they're going. And the more they're threatened, in a sense, the stronger they get. So that, you know, the interdevelopment goals are, you know, let's say another chapter in this kind of meandering journey to find our way back to some sanity. Will they start to have a significant contribution? Maybe, but I think one criterion would be that they have to start to infiltrate a lot of places. And that therein is a real dilemma, because, you know, if they're too simple, people say, well, they're not very profound, or they're too trivial. If they're too complex, a lot of people just ignore them. So that's one of the real problems.
Yeah, it is.
I like the way they're doing it now. I think there's some real good balance.
Yeah, it was. They actually stem from trying to with the Oak Island Foundation to tell the more complex story for 10 years, and just seeing that it's not getting traction. It takes too long time for people to make that initial investment to see if there was a value to get on the end of that narrative. Where now it's flipping it, instead of saying, like, how about we simplify it a bit and then point towards the more complex theories that encompass a lot more of that. And it seems to be at least getting more traction, for sure. But the big question is there, like, how can that be then translated to create real change? To have those conversations that maybe need to happen, or I think that would be a fundamental part of seeing, like, can we be seeing ourselves seeing the situation in a different way? Like, can we put that observing on the table as well, the inner dimension?
Well, I think that is really pretty important. And, you know, the SDGs represent a useful kind of synthesis. You think about that too, you know, it's gone through several cycles of the UN trying to articulate overarching goals for humanity, and finally coming down to something that seems to be simple enough that people can start to get. But it's always a question, since those are so much focused on the consequences of our collective behavior, what do I as an individual do? You know, I think the interdevelopment goals, that's one thing that's pretty distinctive and important. That's an invitation to each of us as individuals. You know, do I really pay attention to how I'm showing up? How I'm listening right now? And those are personal questions. So that's a good thing, because it means in principle there's something there that each person can do their own work. So I don't know. It does seem to me to be addressing this fundamental issue, which I said to me, you have to look back. Well, it depends how you look at it, but at least 500, maybe 1,500 years in the arc of Western culture. This progressive externalization, materialization. You know, Descartes wrote that very famous letter to the Pope around in the early 1500s, in which he said, you know, having watched what happened to Galileo and not wanting that to happen to him, he said, well, there, you know, used Latin terms, re cogens and re extensa, the extended world and the inner world. Res cogens was the Latin for what we would call today the inner world.
Yeah.
And he said to the Pope, we scientists have no interest in res cogens. That's the church.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Yeah.
We won't threaten you. We only want to focus on the extended world. So there's clearly an artifact there of about 500 years which shows a real fork in the road where the Western mainstream culture, which became so dominated by science and now technology, but only the science of the external world, very consciously.
Yeah.
So it's a long-term problem.
Yeah, I heard somebody kind of formulate the crisis that we're in on an individual, societal, global level, that it's a crisis of relationships with ourselves, with others, with how we relate to the natural world, and where we've been interacting in this very materialistic, disconnected way, where we see ourselves as these separate individuals that are also rational, so we're separate from our body.
Right.
We're just our thinking minds.
That's right.
And that's where we create the gap, the knowing-doing gap,
right.
of course, and the gap between what we're creating in society and what we're longing for. Because that gap is, it seems to me, expanding over time. And we're getting less and less of what we're longing for, maybe more of what we want in some places on the planet. But I love the framing that it may be a crisis of relationships.
Me too.
And then it's more actionable, the same as you pointed out with SDGs.
Yeah.
Because also looking at the SDGs, it seems at a glance, for me at least, when I looked at it the first time, or when I was thinking a lot more about sustainability at large, is it's very easy to hit that wall. Also, when you are trying to kind of expand your circle of care, or trying to grasp these massively complex questions, where maybe you started with saying like everybody just needs to understand what happiness is. Like I started, that would be like a pre-tragic approach to saying like maybe more naive approach to say let's just get the information on happiness out into the world.
Right.
I did that. I started an initiative based on happiness research called Happiness Activist when I was younger, and then pushing that out, getting a lot of positive response, but then also kind of hitting that wall of the tragic, of saying like the system has so much inertia and there's so many powerful forces and it's too big for one individual or even a small group to change, and their kind of nihilism setting in, or apathy of just seeing like I have low control and I'm having low impact. And maybe before that I had a sense of high control because I'd simplified the problem so easily, so it felt tangible. And this I see a lot with corporates, with leaders, with the social entrepreneurs. Like they find their thing and they think that that's going to solve it, but it says more maybe about their need of finding a solution to feel that they're important, and then hitting that wall of saying like maybe I succeeded or I didn't succeed, but either way the conclusion is usually it's more complex. And then later what I'm also seeing, especially these last couple of years, is people moving into maybe something called the post-tragic, of saying like, yes, I still have low control in this huge complex system that's evolving and emergent and has these properties, but with the inner dimensions, and especially doing it together, we could actually shift this system, and there is this kind of re-infusion of hope. And that I think is very, I see that a lot with IDGs as well. It's like now we have a map and it's an intrinsically hopeful story to say that we can actually, we are the problem, we are the human beings, and our actions are creating the problems that we're seeing, so we are the problem. That's a tragic conclusion. But it's also, there's a kernel of hope there to say if we're the problem, we can also become the solution, but it actually would then mean that we have to change. Which is maybe humbling, maybe terrifying. Yeah. Well,
At some level, though, as you say, it's also hopeful.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean easy, but that at least there's part of the path that I can see. Then it kind of becomes a matter of choice and perseverance, support.
Yeah,
because
support.
Difficult paths, we always need people helping us.
Yeah.
And it's really hard if you really feel you're alone. So the relational context becomes really important. But just as you said, that we're kind of trying to move together.
Mm.
I think that humans can be extraordinarily resilient working on really, really difficult problems if they feel they have some ideas of what they're working on and they don't feel alone.
Yeah.
The only two conditions that are needed. You know, it's like, I have a vision and I'm going to work on this for the next 2 or 3 years, and we're working on this together. And then, you know, you're kind of aware of all these bigger issues, but they don't make you hopeless. So hopelessness is obviously a very big problem.
So like vision and working together with other
Vision
people.
and relationships.
Vision and relationships. Yeah.
It's not a complicated formula, you know.
No.
And I do think under those circumstances, people can really be resilient because, you know, part of the journey, you've said it a couple times, we're going to hit walls. We're going to go, oh God, I can't believe I did that, or I can't believe we've got this far. And, you know, emissions are still going up.
Mm.
You know, there were a lot of naive expectations, and during COVID, and everybody was locked in there. You know, of course, they were getting all their stuff delivered to their doorstep. I mean, that's pretty carbon intensive. So now we see that, no, actually, the last few years, emissions have gone up. They haven't even started to slow significantly. So those are moments when we go, wow. So, as I say, the resilience in the face of these sort of difficulties is a basic need. And I do think having something you're working on and being with others makes a big difference. We found in a lot of the work we do today in education, there's a kind of phrase that has become a kind of a catch phrase for these two things. That people really focus a lot on what they say, how I show up. Mm-hmm. Which is obviously a very personal thing, but it's also an acknowledgement of relationships. So it's not just how I show up to myself. How am I showing up? How am I being perceived by my colleagues and others around right now? And that, see, it helps people. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make, you know, destabilization of climate any different tomorrow, but you can kind of sit there with that, okay, and know, okay, now, did I listen in that conversation? Or did I show up in a way that really my biases were just overwhelming? Or whatever, but it gives me a path.
Yeah.
Again, it doesn't have to be easy. I don't think easiness or simplicity is ultimately what's needed. You just have to have the sense there really is a path, and you're not alone.
Yeah. Yeah, it does seem that there is this narrative around success, that if I become rich and powerful, I can have an easy life. That would be something that we're striving for, and it kind of inhibits us.
The only problem is that not many rich and powerful people have experienced that. But
no, exactly. It's this complete myth, right? But it primes us to look for easy ways and to be aversive towards struggle, and ultimately that's meaning, right? There's like working and maybe even suffering towards something that is worth it, right?
I think in a way that's not always very obvious, I think that's another consequence of materialization. There's so much emphasis on the physical that when I'm uncomfortable, something's wrong. For most of human history, if I'm uncomfortable, I'm uncomfortable. Wonder what's going on here. You get curious because, but you know, the idea that we should never be uncomfortable. It's a strange one, but it's one that a lot of people have. They think, well, something's wrong, you know, that's why I need, obviously, I'm uncomfortable. That's why the anxiety. I do think this global epidemic of anxiety has its seeds in in beliefs that developed over the last few centuries about you should always be comfortable, you should be happy, not in the way you were inquiring, but happy in the more, everything's fine, which is not really happiness at all. That's kind of could also be a state of massive denial. Everything is fine, and then naturally, if that's what you think good life is all about, once you don't have that, then you feel enormously stressed.
Yeah.
Now, childbirth is not meant to be easy. Right?
No.
I mean, life is full of a lot of things that are really challenging, literally life-threatening, right? But you know that's okay. I mean, as humans, I think we have a lot of capacity to deal with physical and emotional difficulty. One of the first things that meditators often encounter is that, I have all these terrible thoughts, and I'm getting more anxious. Because usually, if you're really first starting to sit, you get more anxious, not less anxious. Let me go have a beer and forget about this. You know, so that intent, though, to kind of be with the suffering, literally the meaning of the word compassion, being with the suffering.
Yeah, exactly.
Just sit there with it, because it will kind of take care of itself. But if I'm so resistant to it, then all my energy gets consumed in the resistance, not the spaciousness that can allow things just to move. An interesting story told to me by a native woman from up north. I mean, up north is Canada, way far north, in the Arctic Circle. So there's a lot of tribes that have lived for years. You know, she had an interesting comment. She said, you know, recently our provincial government has outlawed a lot of hunting. And that was because there was a lot of illegal hunting and people coming in and killing lots of caribou, but they just wanted the antlers. But it applies to our people as well. When we couldn't hunt, suicide rates started to go up dramatically amongst young men. She said, no one understood that, but it was very clear to us. When you hunt, this is a native hunter, you have hours and days of nothing's happening. You're just sitting there. And she said, you learn to deal with the flows of your emotions and thoughts. So in their tribal traditions, hunting is a very meditative process in that sense. And she said, once the young people no longer hunted, they didn't develop the capacity to deal with the ups and downs of their thoughts and emotions. And she said, suicide is almost always a spontaneous act. So therefore, it's just another illustration that we have these innate capacities to hold difficult emotional and physical challenges. And they don't kill us. They may not be pleasant, but again, I'm back to this thing. This material culture shows up in this belief that I should always be pleasant. Everything should be okay. Not really.
Yeah. And would you say, like I'm thinking, your work with compassionate systems, would you want to, for the viewers, you want to expand a little bit on that, segue into that, because it seems being with suffering and then seeing that from a systems perspective, it seems like maybe one of the most crucial things in our time, right?
Well, it may seem very paradoxical, a lot of people, because we tend to think of compassion. First off, the word is tricky. In the American English context, it's often used as a synonym for sympathy, which isn't at all the meaning at all. But so it's like not a very strong word. But if you think of it like we were talking about a minute ago, that developing that capacity, you might say a certain spaciousness in my awareness that I can really be with my fear, I can really be with discomfort, and I can be with your discomfort also. It doesn't mean it's easy, but you know that's a long-term capacity building process. I think systems awareness is by its nature compassionate. Because we've always kind of said, well, one of the defining features of building a more of a systems perspective is you stop blaming individuals. You know, it's the president's fault. It's the CEO's fault. It's all those stupid corporations who only care about profit. Of course, if I were in their shoes, I might act the way they do, not seeing the larger forces at play that are shaping individual behavior. So we tend to blame people, individuals, for what are really not just individual source problems, the problems that arise collectively and institutionally. So in that sense, by its nature, a real systems perspective is compassionate. You can recognize that even the people doing things that you would really wish they wouldn't do, if you were in their shoes, you might be doing a lot of those same things too. So it's a simple way to kind of reflect on the deeper systemic sources of problems. So that's the basic ideas. That compassion and the cultivation of compassion is a very important thing in many, many traditions, West and East. It's interesting, it's a word that has probably as much significance in the Catholic Church as in Buddhism, probably one of the few words. They're both very, but because it's evoking a sense that, well, my journey of being a better person has a lot to do with my ability to just be with suffering or difficulty. The other thing about this that has really been important, it became a vehicle for working more with kids. I mean, I've always wanted to work more in education, not to fix schools, but mainly because schools are where the kids are. And one thing, if you think a lot about systemic problems, like climate change and destruction of ecosystems stuff, you realize that, well, the most important leaders are probably either not born yet, or they're in primary school. I mean, this is going to be not decades, but this is a century. You know, it's taken several centuries to create the predicament we're in now. we're not going to solve it in a few years. So therefore, you start thinking about leadership over long periods of time, which means the role of young people today and the future, but including today. I think the global youth climate movement, one of the most significant political movements in the world, because it's kind of a spontaneous arising from young people going, wait a second, that's my future you're ignoring. And so the legitimacy of that voice has woken a lot of people up. And I think it has a deep legitimacy because it's the voice of the future speaking to us through younger people who are more connected to the future than we are. So that was the other reason. So the compassionate systems work is very much focused on schools and education, but in the broadest sense, not just fixing schools, but evoking youth leadership.
It seems, I mean, thinking that the way forward is through the leaders who are at kindergarten now is a very powerful idea.
Yeah.
And seeing kind of what injections of ideas or context or role models that they have is very central.
It's very central, and it's like a lot of things in our mainstream culture. Once we think about it, we realize, whoa, we're in really bad shape.
Yeah.
Because we really don't pay any attention to kids. I mean, it really, literally. I had a friend who grew up in traditional Hawaiian culture. And when he was about 25 years old, he came to the United States. I think he was going to get a master's degree in education. Eventually became a school superintendent. He told me this story, which I've never forgotten. He said, well, in my traditional culture, when I grew up, if a group of adults are talking and a little child walks over, the adults will always stop talking. And they'll look to the child. Their attention will naturally get. He said, I never got used to in America the opposite happens. They just ignore the child. So we have a long way to go. But it's, the good part about this is not really an intellectual challenge. It's in us biologically, and so we feel it in our heart connection, our natural heart connection to children. Not just my children, but children. It's biological. The human species has evolved in large part because of our ability to collectively assume responsibility for our children. And not the only human species. A lot of the social species are very similar. So in a sense, once you understand it, even though you realize we're probably in difficult shape right now, all you're doing is trying to evoke something that's very deep in us biologically.
Yeah.
So while it's challenging, there's a real reason to be very hopeful that we can find our way back. The traditional Chinese culture, they have a saying that the mark of every golden age, the children are the most important members of society.
Oh.
So it's an old idea.
Yeah.
Because in the end, it really makes a difference, because if you're focused on the kids, you are focused on the future. So it's just logical.
Yeah.
If you're trying to balance short-term and long-term, focus on the kids.
Yeah, exactly. It seems I've been working with schools for a decade, and I heard one principal who was in an auditorium with a lot of parents of the kids in the school, and they were talking about why would they want to work with inner development and skills building and navigating complexity, building relationships. And a father stood up and he said, "So I'm a carpenter. Why would we want to have to navigate a more complex world? My kids could just have my job when they're old. How does this make them get a job in a better way?" The principal was I was quite impressed by her. She said, the point of a school is not only to have the kids, be apt for the job market. There's a lot more important tasks for a school to have. And she was pointing towards, civic leadership or wisdom, or skills building, living in a democracy, taking responsibility. It was a very beautiful moment. It really kind of stopped me in my tracks because she answered him in a very beautiful way. Yeah,
and that makes so much sense. Again, if you think of school and kids as our most direct bridge to the future, if we want a society that works differently, we have to work on the bridge.
Yeah. And what would you say, so for the people who are watching this and are living in the corporate world, I think for the people who are working and can aptly act on the school system, I think they feel hopefully empowered by that message, of course. And for the individuals who are, you know, a couple of steps away from that system, but living in the corporate world, is there, like, how can they be part of this in a constructive way? What is your take on that?
Well, you know, this is a kind of a crude metaphor, but if you think about trying to steer our ship of society along a new pathway, it is like a giant oil tanker, you know, they take days to turn, you know, or certainly many hours to turn. That's the role of long-term leadership. That's the role of the kids. Our job is to keep the ship from sinking in time, right? So we're not going to create a sustainable society or a truly different world than we've lived in. That takes many generations. So that I think our job is to do what we can right now. That's why, you know, if you look at climate change, yeah, mitigation, really changing emissions is clearly the critical thing over the long term. But as we see, it's long term. It's the challenge of the 21st century. In the meantime, we get a lot more efficient and we do what we can and start to move things as far as we can. And see, again, that ability to focus on the short and long term, I think emotionally that's really hard for us right now, precisely because we're disconnected from kids and youth. I think if we had more of an emotional tie, we would just naturally think, well, what can we do in the next 5 years or 10 years? Because we know you are going to be critical for the next 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 decades. Yeah. And you had a sense of, you know, it's a little bit more of a team, to use that kind of metaphor. It's not just about me or us. I think I've always felt a huge blind spot of the sustainability movement. Because you almost never think to involve young people. I think, again, the youth climate movement globally has started to wake people up a little bit, but they're still not exactly sure what to do about it. But I do think people don't think about that. They say somehow we adults are going to turn around global emissions and gradually stop concentration of greenhouse gases coming down. That can't possibly stop in less than 40 or 50 years, the concentration of greenhouse gases. We could turn around emissions in 1 to 2 decades if we really got serious. So it's kind of crazy. If you say it that way, you go, well, that's kind of crazy. I'm not going to be around for most of that. Who is? So again, I think you have to start thinking much more broadly about what does it mean to be the leaders of this, the people who actually are going to be committed to moving things.
And I guess that kind of ties back to the materialistic perspective, where it's just me, my success, my next step, my stuff.
Exactly.
And it's not so much about me as a citizen, me as a father, me as part of the system, and that I'm going to, the results of my actions is the context of the next generation.
That's exactly right.
On an aggregate level,
Exactly
of course.
Right.
So what kind of gift is that? Is it like, we had a great party, now you guys can clean? Or is it like, here, this is something we worked really hard on? I once heard a metaphor that, like, if you look at the statistics of any country, instead of thinking about it as, you know, percentages, just think about it as 100 people. 100 people that live on your street. So it's your street, it's your people, it's your community, it's the people that you love and that you know. Would you be okay with the statistics of youth suicide or mental illness or homelessness? Like, what would you do if that was your little village with people that you cared about? And then it's so tangible, it's so clear what my humanness, what type of corporation would I start, what type of corporate entity, where would the responsibility of that corporate entity end? Because usually it's at the balance sheet, right? Today. It's like at the transaction with the customer. And as long as we have a profit at the end of the year, then we're successful. But if that was happening only within the confounds of 100 people, it would be so obvious that I'm externalizing onto the other 99 people, and that's not a definition of success that's sustainable.
Well, it also illustrates maybe one of the most fundamental challenges of our predicament. when you use that example of 100 people, and that number 100 is not random. There's been lots of studies done. You know, I remember years ago a CEO who was absolutely passionate. He didn't ever want an operating unit of his company to be more than 125 people, because he said, once you have more than that number, there's strangers in your midst. I always remember that phrase. So at that scale, you can feel you know people.
Yeah.
And when you feel like you know them, you may not like them, but you know, your natural sense of mutual shared responsibility is evoked. So it just frames a very interesting question. Given that our scale is so profoundly different today, is this hopeless? Is there a way to evoke that natural human affinity and sense of mutuality, not liking, you know, but just mutuality? What you would say was some sense of mutual responsibility for our collective well-being. How can you do that to scale with that? And it could be, I mean, this is now kind of speculation, no one knows. It could be that the young people could be very important for that too. It could be that one of the positive aspects of this crazy world of global interdependence is there's a little bit more sense of connection. And a little less attachment to the apparatus of the status quo, obviously, but also a sense that, you know, we really are in this together. Because that's the sense we really need, because that 100-person metaphor, that's the key to it all.
Yeah.
I have to feel like, oh, it's you. Not some objectified thing, oh, it's you. You're a pain in the ass. But it's you. See, it's not about liking.
No.
It's really about you are a legitimate human.
Yeah.
And once your legitimacy is evident to me, I will act in different ways. So can the kids help us develop a more expansive sense of mutual legitimacy?
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. Is there any last words you want to leave the people watching?
Oh, obviously we could go on and on. This is a lot of fun, and I'm so happy to learn a little bit about the work you've done around the happiness and stuff. That sound really like important stepping stones. And you know, clearly the whole journey of the Interdevelopment Goals is such a worthwhile undertaking. Well, who knows how it'll turn out? Who knows if it'll turn out to be a huge deal or a very small deal? It doesn't really matter, because no one can know. But it's clearly in the right direction. So it's really important to get involved, and it's fun to be here because I know everybody at a distance, but I don't get to actually be physically together. So we made my little 100-person village a little more tangible.
Yeah. Thanks for being here. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure.
Great.